I know that I'm not smarter than you.
Then how did you catch me, Will?
You had disadvantages.
What disadvantages?
You're insane.
Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and mirror shards in the victim's eyes. I'm Noah Hook, and today we're looking at Manhunter. This 1986 thriller follows FBI profiler Will Graham as he hunts down a serial killer who has been dubbed the Tooth Fairy. He gets a bit too mentally involved with the case, trying his best to become the killer, hoping to figure out his next moves before he strikes again. Manhunter and all of the following Lecter films and shows are based around novels written by Thomas Harris. The 4 books, Red Dragon, The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, and Hannibal Rising all featured the genius cannibal, and most of the films and series pull very directly from these stories. I haven't read any of them, but as far as I know they are all very well regarded. The film was written and directed by Michael Mann, who has brought us films like Thief, The Last of the Mohicans, and Public Enemies. Manhunter is primarily based off of Red Dragon, which Mann was planning on calling the film, but apparently the De Laurentiis group made him change the title because they recently released a movie with the word dragon in it, and they feared people would think it's a kung fu movie. The film stars William Peterson from To Live and Die in LA as FBI profiler Will Graham. He, as well as many cast members, took their roles very seriously and were really close to method acting. He even spent a long time with the Chicago PD's Violent Crime Unit just to understand the daily procedures as well as the mental toll the officers go through. Michael Mann also did similar research, even becoming pen pals with serial killer Dennis Wayne Wallace. These boys were dedicated. Manhunter also stars Dennis Farina as FBI Superior Jack Crawford, Stephen Lang as reporter Freddie Lowndes, Tom Noonan as serial killer Francis Dollarhide, and of course Brian Cox as Hannibal Lecter. Cinematography was done by The Insider's Dante Spinotti, who utilized strong use of color to convey emotions and various frame rates within scenes to make the world feel off-tempo at times. The soundtrack is apparently very domineering, and features rock bands such as Shriekback, The Reds, and Iron Butterfly. Manhunter picked up around $9 million at the box office, only making about half of its budget back. It was met with mixed reviews from critics, some of whom thought it was overly reliant on the harsh pastel colors, the rock soundtrack, and other Michael Mann staples at the time. To give you a clearer picture, the closest thing they had to compare it to at the time was Miami Vice. Reviews have generally become more positive through the decades though, as the pastel colors and other unique features really stand out compared to the later Hannibal Lecter films, although most critics still find the soundtrack unnecessary and dated. It currently has a 93 and 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, which are strong scores, but actually puts it in the middle of the pack for this series. I have never seen Manhunter before, and this is definitely the Lecter film I know the least about going into it. It sounds like it'll be a strong, although dated film, but I am very excited to see what a pre-Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter looks like. Hide your home movies, folks, cause we're watching Manhunter. The movie opens with a POV of a home invader as a woman takes a long-ass time to be woken up by a flashlight. After the credits, we jump to a covert beach meeting between FBI Superior Jack Crawford and former FBI profiler Will Graham. Graham was the best in his field, and Jack needs his help identifying a serial killer. The murderer seems to be working on a lunar cycle, so they only have a few weeks until he strikes again. Will looks over photos of the victims and tells Jack he'll think about helping. Will and his son Kevin put up fencing to protect some future turtle hatchlings, and his wife Molly asks Jack why he couldn't leave Will alone. That night she asks Will to refuse, but he promises her he will only look at evidence and stay far away from danger. Then they get passionate in the blue light. Will is dropped off at the crime scene from the opening and heads upstairs, and it has been turned into a bloodbath. The killer entered very skillfully and wore gloves, but they do know he has blonde hair, size 12 shoes, and A-positive blood, making it clear he doesn't mind leaving evidence. The killer slit the husband's throat and shot the wife before strangling her to death, as well as jamming shards of mirror into her eyes post-mortem. The phone rings, but no message is left, and in his hotel room, Will watches home videos of the Leeds family. He tries to figure out what the killer did between killing Mr. Leeds and the children and stabbing Mrs. Leeds' dead body, but he has no real idea. He calls up Molly to tell her he loves her, and he proceeds to imagine the killer's impulses while killing beautiful Mrs. Leeds. Some talcum powder on her leg indicates he removed a glove to touch her, and Will has Jack fly out a print specialist named Jimmy Price to meet them. Oh, also, the killer has been taking bites out of the victim, so they have a model of what his chompers look like. That has gotten him the nickname of the Tooth Fairy, which the director does not want leaking to the public. Will hypothesizes that the killer's motives lie within his dreams, so they need to identify what fantasies he's trying to live out. Will is also recognized as the guy who caught the famed Hannibal Lecter, a madman who killed 9 people and severely injured 2 others. Will was stabbed in their altercation, which is why he left the force. They also noticed that both families had pets, but while the Leeds dog was stabbed, the other family's cat was never located. Price calls in to say they've gotten a partial thumb and palm print off Mrs. Leeds' big toe and one of the children's eyelids, and they plan to test them against their print index. Freddie Lowndes, a reporter who made big bucks on the Lecter case, starts hassling Will for info, and that gets him some WWE treatment. Turns out Lowndes snuck into the hospital and took photos of Will's wounds after Lecter attacked him, so his anger is pretty reasonable. Will warns Jack that the Tooth Fairy won't stop, but right now he doesn't have enough to help identify him. He decides to go visit Lecter to get back into the serial killer headspace, and the killer immediately recognizes the smell of Will's aftershave. He's happy to see Will, as his usual visitors are annoying psychologists that aren't as smart as him, and he already knows Will has come for some kind of help. Will mentions the Atlanta and Birmingham murders, and Lecter ascertains that he needs help figuring out how the killer chooses his victims. Will says it will be worth his while, as he'll get to look over the fascinating case files and prove whether or not he's smarter than this Tooth Fairy. Lecter says he won't be persuaded by compliments to his intelligence, but he eventually agrees to give an opinion once he reads over the case files. After going through, Lecter determines the killer is very shy and predicts that he chooses victims with private backyards so he can look at the moon during his crimes. He doesn't have much more at the moment, but he's very excited to work with Will and proceeds to tell him they are just alike, as they both get a thrill from the chase. Will has a bit of a panic attack and gets the fuck out of there, even having his vision go blurry for a moment. Perfect timing for punk-ass Lowndes to snap some pictures and put them on the front page. Hannibal jerry-rigs the phone to contact the phone operator and impersonates a disabled person to have them dial him over to one of Will's colleagues, and he easily tricks her into giving him Will's home address. They have found further evidence that the Tooth Fairy kills pets, and as Will dreams of Molly on a plane, he accidentally reveals gruesome photos to a child. He has traveled to Birmingham to inspect the first crime scene, and this time he pays close attention to the yard and from how far away he could have watched the family. He finds a candy bar wrapper and climbs a tire swing up to a perfect peeping spot, which has a strange symbol carved into it. Will believes the killer lurked up here all day watching them before coming down, which is why big wooded yards are necessary. They begin trying to identify the carved symbol and what he used to cut some of the tree branches, and there has been no luck in identifying the print so far. Jack also tells Will that Lowndes put him on the front page, and the warden of Lecter's psychiatric ward calls in. A guard has found a note in Lecter's cell, and it appears to be written by the Tooth Fairy. He is excited that Lecter has taken an interest in him, as only another killer can understand what he is becoming. He's also taken an interest in Will and hopes to stay in communication with Hannibal. He may send Lecter something wet in the future and has bitten into the bottom of the page. They plan to replicate the note so Lecter doesn't warn the Tooth Fairy, and they discover a hair on the note they plan to test against Lecter and the security guard. But the forensic team won't be able to test for a print in the limited time they need, and they wonder how Lecter was supposed to respond, which they assume is explained in the missing section of the note. They're able to look through some of the marker Hannibal used to cover the edges of missing info in order to look at the indents from the Tooth Fairy's pen. They see what look like 3 T's and possibly an R, which they assume said Tattler, the name of Lowndes' newspaper. They believe Lecter was told to respond through the personal ad section of the paper, so they plan to identify Lecter's reply and replace it with one of their own. They'll lure him out to pick up a package he thinks is from Lecter, and then they'll nab him. The hair they found matches the one found at the Jacoby house in Birmingham, confirming that this is the Tooth Fairy. The newspaper has located what they think is Lecter's response, which advises the Tooth Fairy to read over a bunch of Bible verses. They realize some of the verses don't exist in the typical Bible, and they would only be using code within a book that Lecter has access to. They won't be able to figure this out in time to change the ad, and Will decides to let Lecter's ad run as is. They hope they can decipher the code and that it doesn't incite the Tooth Fairy to do something unexpected. Will says he could try to provoke him in next week's paper by writing directly to the Tooth Fairy, and Sydney warns Will that he is going in too deep, just like he did with Lecter's case. They've gone through the whole print index, meaning the prints are of no use right now, and Will has an idea on how to use Lowndes and the Tattler to their advantage. They straight up lie to Lowndes about the killer molesting his male victims, hypothesizing impotence with women, and that he may have had sex with his mother. They plan on putting this info into the Tattler to anger the Tooth Fairy and draw him out, and there has still been no luck in breaking the code. The symbol he cut into the tree turns out to be a Chinese symbol for luck, specifically in relation to gambling. It translates to Red Dragon, which neither of them can correlate to anything useful at the moment. They plan a sting operation as the derogatory news article is released, and Will and Molly do it straight up exhibitionist style. The sting has begun as Will putzes around the Tattler, but unfortunately they just assault a jogger. That's because the Tooth Fairy has his eyes on Lowndes, who gets a chloroform nap. He awakens blindfolded and strapped to a wheelchair, and the Tooth Fairy expresses displeasure with being called a pervert. The killer removes the blindfold and demands he open his eyes, and we get our first look at the Tooth Fairy. He shows Lowndes an image of William Blake's painting titled The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun, as well as photos he took of his victims before, during, and after he killed them. He also has Freddy's newspaper photo, and he rambles on about how Lowndes and the others are just slugs compared to what he is becoming, and that they owe him everything. The Tooth Fairy has him read a note aloud to his tape recorder, which basically says that he knows the newspaper lies were a trap, the Red Dragon is incredible, and Graham won't receive the same mercy that Lowndes will today. That sounds possibly promising for Lowndes, who promises to never lie about the Red Dragon again. The killer decides to seal that promise with a kiss. Just a bit later, we hop over to the National Tattler's parking deck, where Lowndes has been set on fire and pushed down a ramp. Lowndes was a dick, but you guys really failed him. At least they finally broke the code within Lecter's message, and Jack tells Will he gave the Tooth Fairy his home address in Florida. Will rushes to the airport, and Kevin wakes up Molly to tell her somebody is outside. Molly searches the house and sees a shadow, but it's just a whole police task force that Jack sent over. The FBI moves the Grahams to a safe house, and Molly tries to be supportive despite her fear. Will takes Kevin shopping so he can explain what's going on, as he wasn't sure what to make of the newspaper articles he's been seeing. He asks about Hannibal Lecter, and Will explains that he was murdering college girls, one of whom was his psychiatric patient. He went to visit Lecter's office and noticed a grotesque book, and he just knew he had the killer in his sights. Hannibal caught on and attacked Will, and he was hospitalized. But his physical wounds weren't as bad as his mental, as Will spent so long trying to understand the killer that he began to think like one. Dr. Bloom told him he needed help, and after some time, therapy helped Will get back under control. That night, he tells Molly how clueless the case is so far, but he refuses to quit now. He plans on going to Atlanta to isolate himself, presumably to revert back to a killer's mind, and Molly worries he will take things too far again. He tells her to take Kevin to Montana to visit her dad until this is all over, and he hypes himself up at a rainy diner. Now we meet the Red Dragon at his workplace. His real name is Francis Dollarhide, and he works at a film lab in St. Louis. And it looks like he's got his next victims all picked out. He's preparing some film for his next attack with the help of technician Reba, who happens to be blind. Her ride home falls through, and Francis insists he drop her off. She isn't able to see his creepy mannerisms and actually finds him quite charming. He asks if he can bring her somewhere as a surprise on the way, and she agrees, I guess. Wait, what the fuck? He brought her to an animal hospital to pet a tiger that's about to have dental surgery? What? I'm genuinely puzzled, but Frances sure likes the way she touches the tiger. Meanwhile, Will is deep in the midst of becoming the Tooth Fairy, trying to understand what the killer himself believes he's becoming. He believes the use of mirrors has something to do with it, and we rejoin Dollarhide and Reba at his eclectic home. The cheeky bastard is playing the home videos of his next victims, whose films are being processed at their lab, but obviously she can't see it. He starts getting hot and bothered by the film and Reba, and apparently so is she. They have very awkward sex, and I think for the first time in a long time, Frances feels loved and accepted. He finds her outside the next morning and makes sure she doesn't re-enter the home, I guess to ensure that he won't kill her. She agrees to spend more time with him in the future, and he gives her a big ol' hug. They've identified that the killer drives a van through the tire marks at the Tattler, and Will has set up a call with Lecter. Hannibal immediately starts playing mind games, asking him how it felt when he shot a killer, believing he enjoyed it. He continues explaining to Will that killing feels good because it feels powerful and godlike, so killing enough times makes one feel like a god. Will reenacts the killer's entrance into the lead's house, taking on the persona of someone who is self-righteous and feels their purpose is good. He determines the killer only feels accepted when looking into the eyes of his deceased victims. Creepy-ass Frances is waiting outside Reba's when he sees her being dropped off by a different co-worker, and he imagines to himself that they are passionate, glowing lovers. That is not the case, but it doesn't matter as Frances shoots the poor guy a bunch of times. Reba opens up excited to see Frances, but unfortunately for her, Frances is gone forever. Will explains to Jack that the killer wishes to be desired, so he kills and arranges his victims into orchestrated sets of beings that desire him. Combining that with what Lecter told him, this killer thinks if he kills and feels accepted enough, eventually he will be in real life. Will is still puzzled as to why the killer doesn't take some kind of souvenir afterwards and wonders if he records the murders. He knows these families are somehow connected despite the fact the FBI has found zero connections. It's a full moon tonight and Jack has given up hopes of stopping the next murder, but Will says since he's so involved they aren't finished until he says so. He looks over the home movies again and notices a padlock, which explains why bolt cutters were used to cut the branches of the peeping tree. The family ended up replacing the padlock with a deadbolt, so the killer had to find another way in. He also realizes you can't see the lead's glass door unless you're in the yard, and Will realizes that the connection between these families is that they both have home videos. The killer has been proven to idolize the concept of images and seeing, so it makes sense that he would want to see as much as he could before deciding his victims. The killer has seen these films, which allows him to pick his ideal victims and to plan everything he needs to get the job done. They locate the packages that the home movies were developed and shipped from, and they both come from the Gateway Lab in St. Louis. The boys prepare a plane, and poor Reba finds herself in Frances's music-blaring home as he ignores her cries for help. The boys call up the film lab and start retrieving the names of all the employees who drive vans there, and they search them up to see if they match the description they have based on DNA. The first few are duds, but they eventually get to Mr. Dollarhide, and Will is certain this is their guy when his image is faxed over. The St. Louis officers get ready to roll, and the boys hop into a squad car to meet them. Frances breaks himself some reflective new murder weapons, and Will tells the driver to go straight to Dollarhide's house. Jack is concerned with how motivated Will is to take the killer down, and they kill the lights as they pull into his remote driveway. Backup is on the way as they circle the house, and Will spots Dollarhide and Reba. Jack tells him to wait for the SWAT team to arrive, but he keeps marching forward. He rushes forward as Frances looks at himself in a mirror shard, but the killer completely spots the grown-ass man sprinting toward his home. Will action heroes through the window right into Dollarhide's grasp, and he is yeeted into the fridge. Reba crawls to a corner as Frances grabs a shotgun and shoots out the lights, and those crazy frame rate changes begin as he shoots two officers but takes some bullets as well. He also grazes Jack to knock him down, but when he enters the kitchen, Will shoots him a bunch of times to finally put him down. "It's okay, Will, I'm pretty sure he's dead." Backup arrives as Will walks Reba outside, and he and Jack strike a pose by the lake. The movie ends with the turtles hatching and the Graham family united again. And that's Manhunter. This was very interesting. I'm honestly still digesting how I feel about it. The film is really devoted to keeping us in the loop with every piece of evidence, walking us through every dead end that the detectives face. It's very procedural and tedious, but it really helps us understand the exhausted headspace that Will and the others must be in. The movie also shows us very little of Dollar Hyde's violence. We spend more time examining the crime scenes through Will than we actually see the violence firsthand. The movie implies most of the carnage through quick shots of blood-stained rooms or glimpses of crime scene photos, and lets us use our own twisted imaginations to fill in the gaps. It's also very interesting to me that we only enter the story at the beginning of Dollar Hyde's tailspin. In theory, if Francis hadn't been completely distracted by Reba a few days earlier, he would have traveled to wherever the next family was located and successfully murdered them. They would have still arrived at Francis's house and probably confirmed this freak was their guy, but he would have successfully killed another set of victims. The fact they got him, especially before he killed Reba, is sheer luck. The film, like Francis, is driven by sight, perspective, and perception, as even our protagonist is shown to us in reflections almost as often as directly. The first half of the film, we watch Will as he tries to take on the killer's point of view as he enters these crime scenes and tries to see them as the Tooth Fairy would. And around the second half, we finally meet Dollar Hyde and see firsthand his issues with being seen and understood. He finally feels seen by Reba, who ironically can't see him at all, and for a moment feels like the normal man that Will is trying to unbecome. We see through both of their POVs as Dollar Hyde hallucinates and Will tries to envision the things this man sees while he kills. We also spend the first hour studying these horrible things that Dollar Hyde is capable of, but once he meets Reba, we're actually seeing the character at his most vulnerable. I wouldn't go so far to say he's sympathetic, but it's clear his violence comes from a place of anger or sadness, as opposed to the calm, cool Lecter who seems to kill for pleasure. It's also very interesting to me that Hannibal is genuinely a side character in Manhunter. Brian Cox gives a strong, off-putting performance as him, but he's only really here to provide Will with more character development. He feels much more nonchalant than how we'll see Anthony Hopkins play the character, but that makes sense given that they aren't trying to create a horror icon here. The film itself is really more of a neo-noir than it is a straight horror film. The opening sequence really had me thinking this would be scary as shit, but the movie really aims for us to unravel the mystery and dissect the minds of the characters. Also, the movie is so aggressively 80s, the music, the clothes, the sets, everything is a beautiful time capsule. The sets themselves are really interesting and add to the crazy cinematography, but as someone who did not grow up in the 80s, this music feels cheesy as hell and really out of place. I also feel like there are some pretty big jumps in Will's character and his understanding of the killer, and he didn't feel quite as on edge as I would have expected. They got the message across that Will was nearing the brink of madness, but I don't think that it went quite as far as it could have. But overall, Manhunter is a really interesting creative take on this story. It's clear that Mann really took it and made it his own. Peterson and Noonan give excellent performances, and the cinematography is used very intelligently throughout. It's clearly had a big influence on films like Seven, The Bone Collector, and shows like CSI and The X-Files. I don't think Manhunter will end up being my favorite of the franchise, but I definitely think it's a film I'll revisit in the future. Well, that's about it. Next week I'll be looking at a spooky patron review called A Dark Song. Thank you all for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my review of Manhunter. If you enjoyed this review, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support the channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.